The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, a sound like a gavel bringing down a final, crushing verdict. The echo rings through the marble foyer, vast and empty, a space that used to feel like the heart of our home, now just a cold, echoing cavity. I stand there, the crisp legal papers still rustling in my trembling hand. Eviction. From my home. From the life we built, or the life I thought we built. The ink is stark, black against white, spelling out dates and demands, cold, precise language slicing through the fog of my disbelief. The silence in the mansion is deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for air. I look around at the soaring ceilings, the grand staircase, the paintings on the walls that feel like stolen eyes watching me. This can't be happening. Not here.
Not now.
Not after everything. The air conditioning hums faintly, a mechanical breath in this suddenly alien place, and a chill, deeper than the cooled air, settles into my bones. It starts in my fingertips, where the paper feels like ice, and spreads, locking my joints, freezing my breath. I am alone in the middle of a fortress that has just expelled me. If you've ever felt completely blindsided by someone you trusted, please tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps me share these stories more than you know. It wasn't always like this. There was a time this mansion felt like a dream made real. A place of warmth, laughter, endless possibility. We moved in a year after we were married. It was magnificent, sitting on rolling hills, a sprawling estate with ancient trees lining a winding drive.
He bought it, he said. A surprise.
A symbol of our future, our success, our love. He handled everything. The finances, the renovations, the staff. I furnished it, filled it with art, with flowers, with the everyday clutter of a happy life. Our life. Days here were slow, luxurious. Mornings began with coffee on the sun-drenched terrace overlooking the gardens he hired someone to meticulously maintain. Afternoons were spent wandering through the extensive grounds, planning dinner parties, or simply reading in the library. The smell of old paper and polished would a comforting embrace. Evenings were quiet dinners, often just the two of us, talking about our days, our plans. He was attentive, charming, successful. He worked hard, yes, but he always made time for us. He made me feel safe, cherished, like the lady of this grand manor, mistress of my domain. I trusted him implicitly. Why wouldn't I? He had given me everything, a life beyond my wildest dreams. He had taken care of everything. I didn't need to worry about mortgages, deeds, legal structures. That was his world, the world of business and figures. My world was here, within these walls, creating a home, nurturing our relationship, planning our future together. We talked about children, about growing old here. We planted a rose garden, picked out furniture together, debated paint colors for the drawing room. He would travel sometimes for work, and the house would feel vast and empty without him, but his return always filled it with light and energy again. He was my anchor, my partner, the foundation of my secure and beautiful existence. This house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the physical manifestation of our commitment, our shared future. Or so I believed. So he led me to believe. The first crack in the facade was small, almost imperceptible. A subtle tension in his jaw when I mentioned a charity event that required a significant donation. A brief, sharp answer when I asked about refinancing a part of the estate. He brushed it off as business stress, and I accepted it. He carried the weight of his work. I reasoned I shouldn't burden him with trivial questions. I retreated into the comfort of the home I had built, the routines I had established. Then came the arguments. Small at first about insignificant things. A forgotten errand, a misunderstood word. But the underlying current was new, unsettling. A coldness in his eyes I hadn't seen before. An impatience in his voice that chipped away at my sense of security. The mansion, once so welcoming, began to feel observant. The silence seemed to hold its breath, listening. The day it all shattered began like any other. The sun rose over the eastern wing, painting the breakfast room in gold. The smell of coffee filled the air. He sat across from me, seemingly absorbed in his tablet, the usual morning routine. But the air felt thick, heavy. When he finally looked up, his expression was flat, devoid of warmth.
He didn't speak.
He just slid a thick envelope across the table. My name was printed on it in stark, official lettering. Inside were the papers. The eviction notice. My world imploded in that instant. The sunbeams vanished. The scent of coffee turned to ash. My hands shook as I unfolded the documents, my eyes scanning the legalese, the cold terms. 30 days. To vacate the premises. Premises, not home. Property, not our life.
It was signed by him.
As the owner. What is this? My voice was a whisper, thin and reedy in the sudden, cavernous silence of the room. He didn't flinch. His expression remained impassive, almost bored. Exactly what it says. I need you to leave. Leave? This is our home. It's my property, he corrected, his voice low, devoid of emotion. Legally solely mine. Always has been. The words hit me like physical blows. Solely mine? Always has been. What was he talking about? We bought this together. This was ours. What are you talking about? We bought this house together. Our names. No, he interrupted, his gaze cold. My name. Only mine. I handled the purchase, remember? I put everything in place. He leaned back, a flicker of something, satisfaction? Cruelty? Crossing his face. You didn't read the documents closely, did you? The deed, the mortgage. They're all solely in my name. This house, this estate is legally mine. And I'm asking you to leave. The world tilted. The solid ground beneath me dissolved. All the talk of our future, our home, our life here. A lie. A meticulously crafted illusion. He hadn't built our future. He had built his own fortress, and I was merely a temporary guest he was now discarding. The betrayal was a physical pain, a twisting in my gut, a constriction in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I tried to reason with him.
He pleaded, he cried, he demanded explanations.
Was there someone else? Was it about money? He remained unmoved. His responses were short, clipped, legalistic. He spoke of financial reasons, restructuring his assets, needing to liquidate. It felt like he was reading from a script, a cold, heartless performance designed to dismantle my life piece by piece. He had planned this. He had been planning this for a long time. The thought was a chilling realization. Every smile, every touch, every shared dream in this house. Had it all been a performance? The early days of the eviction notice were a blur of panic and disbelief. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, the walls, trying to anchor myself in the reality of what was happening. Each object was steeped in memories, now tainted with the poison of his deceit. The grand piano where I sometimes played felt like a monument to a lost symphony. The portraits on the walls, chosen together, seemed to sneer. I called friends, but his narrative had clearly reached them first. They were hesitant, uncomfortable. He said it's complicated. One friend mumbled, business things. I'm sure it will work out, another advised me to just comply. He's a powerful man. You don't want to make things difficult. Isolation set in, thick and suffocating as the mansion's walls now felt less like protection and more like confinement. I was a ghost in my own life, wandering the halls of a place that was no longer mine. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She looked at the papers, her brow furrowed. It's complex, she said, echoing my friend, but with a different weight. The ownership structure is unusual. It's layered, she explained the basic premise. Legally, the deed was in his name, making it his property. Our marriage, while providing some claims on marital assets acquired during the marriage, didn't automatically override pre-existing property rights or properties structured in specific ways before, or even during the marriage, if handled carefully. He had handled it carefully, devilishly carefully. Eleanor tried negotiation, appealing to fairness, to the length of our marriage, to the principle of a shared home. His response was swift and brutal. He cut off access to joint accounts, froze my credit cards, essentially leaving me financially stranded within the very house he was evicting me from. He was applying pressure, making my continued presence unbearable, forcing my hand. The mansion became a gilded cage. Food in the pantry dwindled, utilities felt precarious, the staff, clearly instructed, avoided eye contact and performed their duties with chilling efficiency, like robots programmed to erase me. Every day the clock ticked down felt like a hammer blow against my dwindling hope. 30 days wasn't just a deadline, it was a countdown to losing everything. Not just the house, but my stability, my identity, my sense of reality. He had stripped me bare, leaving me vulnerable and alone. I felt a raw, desperate fear I hadn't known existed. Where would I go? How would I even begin to rebuild? Eleanor fought for extensions, arguing the complexity of the case, the unusual circumstances. He fought back harder, filing motions, demanding immediate compliance, painting me as an unreasonable, gold-digging wife refusing to leave property that was never hers. The legal battle was less about justice and more about attrition. He had unlimited resources. I had a ticking clock and dwindling options. The weight of it all became crushing. I spent days curled up on the window seat in the library, watching the rain lash against the glass, feeling as if the storm outside was a mirror of the turmoil within. The grandeur of the room, the thousands of books, offered no solace. They were just silent witnesses to my humiliation. The house, once full of light, now seemed permanently shrouded in shadows. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a threat. Every gust of wind against the eaves felt like a mournful sigh. One evening, huddled in the cold living room, the silence pressing in, I found myself staring at a large, framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of my grandfather, a man who had passed away years ago, long before I met my husband. He was standing on the lawn, a much younger version of the man I knew, smiling wryly, the mansion visible behind him. My grandfather was a private man, eccentric, a lover of history and old things. He wasn't known for immense wealth, or at least not in the conventional sense. He had been a scholar, a collector, someone who valued lineage and legacy over liquid assets. A memory stirred, faint at first, like a distant echo. My grandfather, sitting in his study, surrounded by maps and old documents. Me, a child, asking about the big house on the hill, the one we could see from his smaller, cluttered cottage nearby. He had smiled a knowing smile and said something about roots, about permanence, about things not always being what they seem on the surface. He had owned land around here, I knew that. Small plots, nothing significant, or so I'd thought. Suddenly, my mind raced back. The way my husband had surprised me with the house. How he had insisted on handling everything. How he had dismissed any questions about the previous owners, waving them away as just business. He had presented it as a straightforward purchase from some anonymous seller. But what if it wasn't? What if the history was more complicated? I remembered my grandfather's meticulous nature, his fascination with property laws from different eras, his collection of antique legal texts. He was a man who planned, who saw generations ahead. The faint memory of his words, things not always being what they seem, resonated with a new intensity. What if the surface wasn't the reality? What if the layers Eleanor mentioned were more than just complex financing? Driven by a desperate flicker of hope, I started searching. I couldn't access my husband's files, but I still had some boxes of my grandfather's things that had been stored in the attic, brought here when we moved in. Boxes I hadn't looked at in years, full of old books, papers, diaries. The mansion felt oppressive, but now it also felt like a library I had to search before being cast out. Days blurred into nights spent sifting through dusty documents. Old deeds, brittle letters, leather-bound journals. Most of it seemed irrelevant, family history, philosophical musings, notes on ancient architecture. But buried deep in one box, beneath a pile of faded photographs, I found a small, metal strongbox. It was locked, But I remember my grandfather kept a spare key hidden inside a specific antique clock in his study, a clock I had inherited and was now in the mansion's drawing room. My heart pounded as I retrieved the key, my hands shaking again, but this time with a frantic energy, not fear. The key clicked in the lock. Inside the box were more documents, tied with faded ribbon. Not recent papers, but old ones. Very old. Dates from decades ago. Legal documents with elaborate seals. My grandfather's name was on them. Lots of names I didn't recognize. And property descriptions. Descriptions that matched the estate. Not just a small part of it, but the entire estate. My grandfather hadn't just owned land near the mansion. He had owned the mansion itself, and the hundreds of acres surrounding it.
But how? When?
And if he owned it, how had my husband bought it? I kept reading, my eyes straining in the dim light of the attic. These weren't just old deeds. They were documents related to a specific type of trust. An irrevocable trust, established decades ago. A trust designed to hold the property for generations, protecting it from being sold or divided easily. A trust with specific beneficiaries and conditions. And my name. My name was listed. Not as a primary beneficiary yet, but as a contingent one. And then I found another document more recent, dated just a few years before his death. An amendment. An amendment that changed my status. It wasn't as simple, well, leaving me assets. It was something else. Something related to the trust. I gathered the documents, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold them. I called Eleanor, interrupting her late on a Friday night. Her voice was tired, but when I described what I found, her tone shifted. She told me to bring everything immediately. We met at her office. She spread the documents across the large conference table, her initial skepticism turning to intense focus. She put on reading glasses, leaned closer, tracing the lines of archaic legal language with her finger. Hours passed. The city lights came on outside her office window. We ordered cold pizza. Finally, she leaned back, removing her glasses, rubbing her eyes. She looked at me, and there was a dawning amazement in her expression. "This is remarkable," she said softly. "Your grandfather was brilliant and incredibly foresight." She explained it to me, translating the complex legal terms. The trust wasn't simple. It was designed to ensure the estate remained intact, managed according to specific principles. The primary beneficiary for a long time was a distant relative who had recently passed away without heirs, a detail I hadn't known or hadn't registered. The amendment my grandfather made years ago changed the contingency. Upon the primary beneficiary's death, control and primary beneficial interest in the trust, and thus the estate, passed to
Me.
not upon his death, but upon the previous beneficiary's death, which had happened quietly a few months before my husband had supposedly bought the house. My husband hadn't bought the estate. He couldn't have. It wasn't his to buy. It was held in an irrevocable trust. What he had done, Eleanor speculated, was likely far more nefarious. He must have discovered, somehow, that the previous beneficiary was ill or had died. He must have found a way to present himself as the legal owner, perhaps through forged documents, or by deceiving the trust's administrators if they were negligent or involved in his scheme. He had created an elaborate illusion of ownership, likely with the intent to quickly sell off pieces of the estate or leverage its value before the complex truth of the trust and my place in it could surface. He was trying to evict me not because he owned the house and wanted me out, but because I was the rightful beneficiary of the trust that owned the house, and my presence, my knowledge of my grandfather, posed a threat to his monumental fraud. He needed me gone, ignorant and powerless, before I could uncover the truth. The implication was staggering. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had attempted a massive, audacious criminal fraud, using me and our marriage as cover. He didn't own the ground he stood on. I did. Well, the trust did, and I controlled the trust. A cold, quiet rage settled over me. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath my skin, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, unwavering determination. He had tried to erase me, to leave me with nothing. But in his greed, in his arrogance, he had missed a crucial detail: my grandfather's legacy. The next few days were a blur of frantic legal work. Eleanor and her team moved with incredible speed, armed with the trust documents. They filed injunctions, presented the evidence to the court, informed the relevant authorities about the fraudulent purchase my husband had orchestrated. The eviction case was instantly turned on its head. The man claiming ownership was now being investigated for fraud and potentially facing charges related to the attempted theft of a massive estate. My husband's legal team was blindsided. They had built their case entirely on the premise of his legitimate ownership, backed by what they believed were solid, albeit complex, transaction records. They had no idea the estate was held in an ancient, ironclad trust, or that I was the rightful beneficiary. His lawyers, likely realizing the depth of his deception and the precariousness of their own position, began to distance themselves. The confrontation came not in a courtroom, but during a scheduled hearing about the eviction, which was now thrown into chaos. I sat with Eleanor, feeling a strange calmness wash over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He walked in, flanked by a new, nervous-looking lawyer. He saw me, and for the first time since he'd served me the papers, I saw a flicker of something other than cold indifference in his eyes.
It was surprise.
And then, as his lawyer whispered urgently to him, pointing towards Eleanor and the stack of documents before her, surprise morphed into dawning horror. Eleanor stood up, addressing the judge calmly. She didn't speak about marital disputes or eviction. She spoke about trusts, about fiduciary duties, about fraudulent conveyance, about the true, legally documented ownership of the estate. She laid out the timeline, the deception, the attempt to evict the rightful beneficiary. She presented the original trust documents, the amendment, the proof of the previous beneficiary's death, and my legal position. I watched my husband's face. The color drained from it. His jaw went slack. The arrogance, the cold control he had maintained for weeks, crumbled in an instant. He looked like a man watching the ground disappear beneath his feet. He muttered something to his lawyer, his voice hoarse. His lawyer looked pale, shaking his head slightly. Eleanor concluded by requesting the immediate dismissal of the eviction case, an injunction against my husband interfering with the estate or me, and the initiation of proceedings to formally transfer control of the trust to me, confirming my status as the primary beneficiary and effective controller of the estate. The judge, a stern woman who had looked bored just minutes before, was now leaning forward, her expression sharp with attention. She asked a few pointed questions about the trust documents, their authenticity, their legal standing. Eleanor answered clearly, referencing specific clauses and historical precedents. Finally, the judge looked at my husband and his stunned lawyer. "Mr. Husband's last name," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Based on the compelling evidence presented by Ms. My last name, as counsel regarding the nature of the trust holding this estate, it appears your claim of sole ownership is significantly challenged." To say the least, she paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. "In light of this information, and the allegations of fraudulent activity surrounding your purported purchase, I am not only dismissing this eviction case immediately, but I am also issuing the requested temporary injunctions. Further proceedings will address the very serious questions of how you came to be in possession of these properties and the claims Ms. My last name has under this trust." He stared at me across the room, his eyes no longer cold, but filled with a raw, panicked disbelief. He had overplayed his hand. He had been so sure of his meticulous plan, so certain that he held all the cards, that I was helpless, ignorant, easily disposable. He had been so focused on the surface illusion of ownership, the fake papers he'd shuffled, that he'd never bothered to look beneath the foundation, to the bedrock of ancient law and my grandfather's quiet brilliance. He had tried to evict me from my home, from my legacy, and in doing so, he had walked directly into a trap that had been set generations ago. He had poisoned the well, thinking he was the only one who could drink from it, only to find the well belonged to me. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The legal system, once slow and intimidating, moved rapidly once the scale of the fraud was revealed. Investigations were launched. His assets were frozen. The illusion of his success and power evaporated like mist in the sun. The friends who had been hesitant to help me now reached out, some apologetically, some simply curious. The staff at the mansion, now understanding the truth, treated me with a newfound respect, a quiet deference. I moved back into the main bedroom, the very room he had tried to force me out of. The mansion still felt strange, imbued with the ghosts of betrayal and lies, but it also felt different. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a testament to my grandfather's foresight, a symbol of resilience, a battleground where I had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged, bruised but victorious. I walked the grounds, no longer a bewildered guest, but the custodian of a legacy. The ancient trees, the rolling hills, the solid walls of the mansion felt less like possessions and more like responsibilities. It wasn't the life I had planned, the one filled with the simple happiness of a shared home. That version was gone, shattered by his deceit. But in its place was something else. A profound understanding of strength, both my grandfather's and my own. A stark, clear vision of loyalty and betrayal. And the quiet, cold satisfaction of knowing that the man who tried to take everything from me ended up losing absolutely everything he thought he had. He wanted the mansion. He lost his freedom, his reputation, every dollar he'd acquired through deception. He wanted to evict me. Instead, he evicted himself from a life of privilege and lies. The house, the estate, remains. It waits now for me to decide its future, a future that is, finally, truly mine. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to fight for what's truly yours, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. And please consider subscribing. It helps me keep telling these stories. Thanks for being here.